So how do we put this into practice? Now that we've identified the spectrum of cultural variances, based on these tenets of PBS, we want to take a closer look at the tool that Joe actually mentioned earlier by Chen et al., where she gives questions for us to kind of guide our practice so that we're more culturally responsive. So we picked out a few so that we can discuss them in more detail and kind of share some of the strategies and experience that we've had. As you saw earlier, there's 3 parts to the tool. And the first one is planning. So within planning, one of the questions we want to ask ourselves is, how do I learn about the family's interaction and their communication style? So we think one of the most important things to do is to develop rapport. The more rapport that you have with the family, the more comfortable they're going to be to share information with you, really important information that's going to impact your implementation. And as I think Mariko mentioned earlier, the functional assessment process starts with an interview, but a lot of families aren't very comfortable just sitting down and doing an interview right from the get-go. You kind of have to develop that rapport, have some more informal conversations with them before starting that. They might even be kind of offended by that process. So we want to really observe and pay attention to the way the family communicates so that we can gain information. Some families might prefer more formal meetings, some might prefer more informal contacts, and they don't really like going to a group meeting with 15 people sitting there staring at them. I have a lot of families that are very quiet at those meetings, but then when we leave the meeting, they'll have individual conversations and they will share a lot more information that way. We want to be aware of nonverbal communication as well. For example, eye contact can be a sign of respect in some cultures, but it can actually be the opposite. It could be a sign of disrespect in other cultures. So just because a parent is not looking at you might not mean that they're not listening to you or they're not being respectful. Or for example, like a head nod. There are, in some cultures, families might be more likely to nod their head to indicate that they're listening to you, but not necessarily agreeing with what you're saying. So if you're talking to a parent about strategies and they're nodding, and then you're taking that as, oh, they've agreed, and you go to implementation and then wonder why there's no follow-through, you might want to look at, okay, maybe they were just nodding to show that they were listening. You just kind of have to look at the communication styles, make sure you're asking the right questions and being just open-minded and aware. There's a family that I'm supporting who's from Syria, and they speak very little English. They speak Arabic. And at the beginning, we asked the family, what's the best way to communicate with you? Because there is a language barrier, should we email? Should we call you? Text messages, what's the best way to communicate? And they said yes to everything. They're like, yep, no problem, yep, it's all good, it's all good. And we kind of assumed maybe email might be good because then they can translate it. They can have somebody read it to them, maybe having it in writing might be helpful. But then we started realizing that they never responded to any of our emails. Every time we emailed, we wouldn't get a response. So maybe they are reading it, maybe someone's translating it, but maybe they're not able to write back. So then we really had to kind of just try different modes of communication and figure out what's working. We realized that when we messaged them, it worked. We realized that we really need a lot of face-to-face interactions. We make sure we schedule really frequent visits in their home so that we can actually write a date down on the calendar for them as opposed to saying it to them over the phone. In person, we were able to use a lot more gestures, and if that didn't work, we would actually take out Google Translate and type things in so that we can do that on the spot. So we really found that we had to try out different ways of communicating with them and then figure out what works for them. Another way of learning about the communication style is asking other people. So when you start working with a family, there might be already other service providers in place that maybe they could share information about their experience so far, how they find a family communicates, get more information about the best way to support the family. And often when working with families from different cultures, language barrier is a huge thing. So Definitely one way to overcome this is to try to get interpreters. Joe mentioned earlier that the challenge of having interpreters maybe bring in their own opinions and not being completely neutral, and I've definitely experienced that a lot. So even if they speak the language as well, they might not know kind of some of the more technical things that we're trying to explain to parents. So sometimes you really have to try to explain that to the interpreter in order for them to explain it to the family. And also remember that just because the interpreter speaks the same language, they actually might not have the same cultural values as that particular family as well. Going back to that example with the family I'm supporting who's from Syria, when we first met with them to do an intake, although I really wanted to work with the family, I recognized that the best thing to do was probably to see if there is an Arabic-speaking BCBA in the province to work with them. There is one, I believe, but unfortunately she wasn't available to work with them. So we happily started to work with the family, but we realized that one of our top priorities right at the beginning was figuring out how to communicate with the family. So we contacted organizations like Mosaic to see if we can get translators to come to meetings with us. We reached out to student volunteers from universities who might be taking Arabic classes because the family couldn't afford to pay for an interpreter as well. So we needed to try to find access to some volunteers for them. The family sometimes would bring family friends to the meetings to help out. And they also have a child and family settlement worker that helps out with us quite a bit. We tried to hire an Arabic-speaking interventionist to work with the team, and that didn't quite work out that well because you have to weigh her ability to translate with her actual competencies as a BI, and in the end, the parents decided that that wasn't as important to them, and they preferred to work with more experienced BIs, and we just figure out the language barrier in other ways. And one thing we found in working with the family was we had to do a lot more modeling and a lot less verbal and written instruction with them. So everything that we were doing, we were in the home showing them how to do it with lots of repetition as opposed to just telling them how to do it at a meeting. Another example about overcoming the language barrier, this was in Chemshinsky's study, and she also described how she actually learned some key phrases of that family's language in order to be more successful in working with the family. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can learn about the communication style and also try to overcome those barriers.